In the dusty plains of the wild American West, where the sun burned hot and mercy ran cold, there stands a story that still echoes through the ages like thunder across empty canyons. Picture this moment if you can. A woman alone, her dress torn and dirty, her hands bleeding from splinters, hammering broken and burned pieces of wood together while the harsh wind whipped dust into her eyes. Behind her, standing perfectly still like a statue carved from stone, was a man who said nothing, did nothing, just watched her every movement with eyes that revealed no emotion. This was not a stranger. This was her dead husband's brother, and his silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. This is the story of Sarah McKenna, a woman who lost everything in a single terrible month but refused to lose herself. This is a tale of strength born from suffering, of dignity rising from despair, and of one woman's battle not just against the harsh frontier, but against the expectations of everyone who thought they knew what a widow should be and how she should behave. Her journey begins in tragedy and unfolds in ways that would change not just her own life, but the lives of countless women who would hear her story and find courage in its telling. The year was 1873, and Sarah McKenna stood on land that had once held all her dreams but now held only ashes and memories. Just 3 weeks before this moment, her husband Thomas had been riding with a cattle drive when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him hard against the rocky ground. Thomas never opened his eyes again after that fall. He died 2 days later while Sarah held his hand and whispered promises she did not know how to keep. The grief that crashed over Sarah felt like drowning in a river with no bottom and no shore. She was 28 years old, far from the comfortable Philadelphia home where she had grown up, alone on the frontier with no children and no family nearby, except for one person she barely knew. Thomas had been her anchor, her guide, her companion in this wild territory, and now he was gone forever. But grief was not the only disaster that struck Sarah during those dark days. Less than a week after Thomas's funeral, while Sarah sat outside staring at nothing, a cooking fire inside their small cabin got out of control and spread faster than anyone could stop it. By the time Sarah noticed the smoke, flames had already consumed half the structure. She tried to save what she could, but the fire was too fierce and too fast. Within an hour, everything she and Thomas had built together over 7 years of hard work had been reduced to smoking ruins and piles of blackened wood. Daniel McKenna was 32 years old when his brother died, and he had spent most of his life living in Thomas's shadow. Where Thomas had been bold and outgoing, Daniel was quiet and watchful. Where Thomas made friends easily and spoke his mind freely, Daniel held his thoughts close and rarely shared what he truly felt. The two brothers had grown up together in this harsh territory, sons of a rancher who died when they were young, leaving them to make their own way in the world. Thomas had married Sarah and built a small ranch on land their father had left them. Daniel had taken a different portion of that same land and built his own smaller ranch about 5 miles away. He had never married, never seemed interested in courting any of the available women in the territory, and spent most of his time alone with his cattle and his thoughts. The relationship between Daniel and Sarah had always been strange and distant. Daniel came to Sunday dinners at their cabin and helped during busy seasons, but he rarely spoke directly to Sarah and never stayed longer than absolutely necessary. Thomas used to tease his brother about being shy, but Sarah always sensed something deeper and more complicated in Daniel's silence. When news of Thomas's death reached Daniel, he rode immediately to Sarah's land. He arrived just in time to see the last flames consuming the cabin, just in time to see Sarah on her knees in the dirt with soot covering her face and tears making clean tracks through that soot. Daniel dismounted and stood there watching her, just as he would stand and watch her many times in the coming weeks. He did not rush to her side. He did not offer comforting words or helpful suggestions. He simply stood at a distance and observed her grief with eyes that showed no readable emotion. After several long minutes of this silent observation, Daniel mounted his horse again and rode away without speaking a single word. Sarah barely registered his presence at the time. She was too deep in her own despair to wonder why Daniel had come or why he had left without saying anything. But in the days that followed, Daniel's strange behavior would become impossible to ignore and impossible to understand. 3 days after the fire, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. She decided to stay. She decided to rebuild. She decided that Thomas's death and the loss of their cabin would not drive her away from the land they had chosen together. This decision was not based on careful planning or practical thinking. Sarah had almost no money, no materials to build with, and no real skills for construction. What she had was a burning need to prove something, though she could not have explained exactly what or to whom. Maybe she needed to prove that she was stronger than her circumstances. Maybe she needed to prove that Thomas had not made a mistake when he brought an Eastern City girl to this harsh frontier. Maybe she just needed to stay busy so grief could not swallow her whole. Whatever the reason, Sarah began gathering the burned boards from the cabin ruins, sorting through them to find pieces that might still be usable even though they were charred and cracked and warped from the heat. She had one possession of real value left: her grandmother's gold wedding ring that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. Sarah walked the 5 miles into town and traded that precious ring at the general store for a hammer, a small bag of nails, a bag of flour, and some basic supplies. The store owner, a kind man named Mr. Patterson, tried to give her more in exchange because he knew the ring was worth considerably more than what she was taking. But Sarah refused charity. She took only what she needed immediately and walked back to her burned land with her few supplies and her determination. Using the blackened and broken boards she had salvaged, Sarah began building a small lean-to shelter against the one stone wall that had survived the fire. She had watched Thomas build things over the years but had never done much construction herself. Her early attempts were clumsy and frustrating. Boards would not fit together properly. Nails bent when she struck them. Her hands, unused to this kind of rough work, quickly developed painful blisters that burst and bled. But Sarah kept hammering, kept trying, kept building despite her inexperience and her pain. It was on the 2nd day of Sarah's building efforts that Daniel returned. Sarah was struggling to hold a warped board in place while trying to hammer it to a support post when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up and saw Daniel riding slowly toward her property. Her first thought was relief. Perhaps he had come to help. Perhaps he would take pity on his brother's widow and offer the assistance she desperately needed but was too proud to ask for directly. Daniel rode to within about 30 feet of where Sarah worked, then stopped his horse and dismounted. Sarah waited for him to come closer, to say something, to do something. But Daniel simply stood there, his face expressionless, his posture relaxed, watching her struggle with the board and the hammer. Several minutes passed in silence. Sarah finally called out to him, asking if he needed something or if he had come to help. Daniel did not respond. He just stood there watching. The silence became uncomfortable, then strange, then almost unbearable. Sarah turned back to her work, acutely aware of Daniel's eyes on her, feeling judged and observed in a way that made her skin crawl with discomfort. After about an hour of this silent observation, Daniel mounted his horse and rode away without ever having spoken a word. Sarah stood there with the hammer hanging loose in her hand, completely confused by what had just happened. Why had he come? What had he wanted? Why had he just watched her without offering any help or explanation? That night, lying on the hard ground wrapped in her one remaining blanket under the stars because her shelter was not yet enclosed enough to provide real protection, Sarah tried to make sense of Daniel's behavior. She wondered if he was angry with her for some reason, if he blamed her for Thomas's death or for the fire, if he resented her presence on land that had originally belonged to the McKenna family. But none of these explanations felt quite right. Daniel's watching had not felt angry or resentful. It had felt more like evaluation, like he was studying her to determine something important, though Sarah could not imagine what that might be. Daniel came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He always arrived around the same time in the afternoon. He always stopped at the same spot about 30 feet from where Sarah worked. He always stood there in silence, watching everything she did, and he always left after an hour or two without ever speaking a word. This pattern repeated itself day after day until it became a strange constant in Sarah's life. At first, she tried to ignore him. She focused on her work and pretended Daniel was not there, though his presence made her self-conscious and nervous. Every clumsy mistake she made, every time a board fell or a nail bent, she felt certain Daniel was noting her failure and judging her inadequate. But as days turned into a week and then 2 weeks, Sarah's feelings about Daniel's vigil began to shift. The initial confusion and discomfort evolved into anger. Who was he to stand there watching her struggle without offering any help? What right did he have to observe her suffering like she was some kind of entertainment or scientific experiment? The anger gave Sarah energy. She began working harder and more determinedly, driven partly by the desire to prove to this silent judge that she was stronger than he obviously believed her to be. Sarah's shelter slowly took shape despite all the difficulties. The structure was small, barely large enough for one person to lie down in, and it was far from beautiful or well-crafted. The burned boards did not fit together smoothly. Gaps between the boards let wind whistle through. The roof, made from a few pieces of salvaged tin she had found in the ruins, rattled loudly whenever the wind blew. But it was shelter, basic protection from sun and rain, and it was something Sarah had built with her own bleeding hands. Every crooked nail represented her refusal to give up. Every poorly fitted board spoke of her determination to survive. The townspeople who heard about Sarah's situation had mixed reactions. Some admired her courage and independence. Others thought she was being foolish and stubborn, that she should accept help or return to her family in the East where life would be easier. A few gossiped about Daniel's strange behavior, wondering aloud why Thomas's brother would watch his widow struggle instead of stepping in to help like any decent man should. But Daniel seemed completely unconcerned with what people said or thought about him. He continued his silent daily visits with the same mysterious consistency. As weeks passed, Sarah's situation became increasingly desperate in ways that went beyond just building shelter. The bag of flour she had bought with her wedding ring was running low. She had no vegetable garden because the fire had destroyed the small plot she and Thomas had carefully cultivated. She had no chickens for eggs, no cow for milk, no stored food of any kind. Sarah tried to supplement her meager supplies by gathering wild plants and berries, but her knowledge of which plants were safe to eat was limited, and the dry season meant food was scarce even for experienced foragers. She grew thinner as the days passed. Her clothes, which had fit properly when Thomas was alive, now hung loose on her shrinking frame. Hunger made her weak and dizzy. Sometimes while she worked on expanding her shelter or trying to make it more weatherproof, Sarah would have to stop and sit down because the world started spinning and her vision went dark at the edges. These were the moments when she came closest to giving up, when the idea of walking into town and begging for help or accepting that she could not survive alone seemed like the only reasonable choice. But something stubborn and fierce inside Sarah refused to surrender. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was grief channeled into determination. Maybe it was the presence of Daniel watching her every day, his silent observation feeling like a challenge she had to meet. Whatever the source of her stubbornness, Sarah continued pushing forward even as her body weakened from lack of food. She tried to make her small supply of flour last longer by mixing it with water and wild grass seeds to make thin cakes that filled her stomach, even though they had almost no real nutritional value. She dug for roots that animals ate, figuring they must be safe for humans too. She caught rainwater in her cracked barrel and rationed it carefully. She learned to ignore the constant gnawing pain of hunger, to work through the weakness and dizziness, to keep hammering even when her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the hammer steady. Through all of this, Daniel kept coming, kept watching, kept saying nothing. His continued presence during her worst suffering felt cruel to Sarah. She sometimes fantasized about screaming at him, about demanding to know what he wanted or why he tortured her with his observation. But she kept those feelings inside, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. The breaking point came on a cold morning in early autumn when Sarah had been rebuilding for nearly 2 months. She had expanded her small shelter slightly and made it more weatherproof, but it was still primitive and barely adequate. More importantly, her flour was completely gone. She had not eaten anything except a handful of bitter berries in 3 days. Her body was so weak that even standing up required tremendous effort. That morning, Sarah was trying to reinforce the roof of her shelter before the autumn rains began. She climbed onto a wobbly stack of boards to reach the top of the structure, stretching up with a board in one hand and the hammer in the other. But her weakened body could not maintain balance. Her vision went dark, her legs buckled, and she fell backward off the stack. She hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of her lungs and sending sharp pain shooting through her back and ribs. The hammer flew from her hand and struck her ankle with enough force to make her cry out. Sarah lay in the dirt, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, tears of pain and frustration streaming down her face. This was the lowest moment of her entire ordeal, the point where survival seemed not just difficult but truly impossible. She had tried so hard. She had endured so much, but her body was failing. She was starving and injured and completely alone except for the silent man who watched her suffer without offering any help at all. Through her tears, Sarah saw Daniel standing in his usual spot. He had witnessed her fall. He had seen her lying helpless in the dirt. And still he just stood there, expressionless and motionless, watching. Something inside Sarah finally snapped. All the anger and frustration and confusion she had been holding inside for weeks came pouring out in a flood of words. She shouted at Daniel from where she lay in the dirt. She demanded to know what he wanted from her. She asked why he came every day just to watch her suffer. She accused him of cruelty, of taking pleasure in her pain, of being a coward who let his brother's widow starve rather than offering the help that any decent person would provide. Her words were angry and desperate and raw with emotion. She told him that if he would not help her, then he should at least have the decency to leave her alone to struggle without an audience. She said his silent watching was worse than being completely alone, that his presence without assistance felt like judgment and mockery. Sarah's angry words hung in the air between them after she finally ran out of breath and energy to continue shouting. The silence that followed felt different from all the previous silences, heavier and more charged with meaning. Sarah lay in the dirt, her body aching, tears still wet on her face, waiting for Daniel to turn and leave as he always did. But this time, Daniel did not leave. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He spoke. His voice was rough and quiet, the voice of someone unused to speaking, but his words were clear enough to carry across the distance between them. Daniel said that he had been waiting to see if she was strong enough. He said that Thomas had asked him years ago, during a private conversation that Sarah had never known about, to look after her if anything ever happened to him. But Thomas had not asked Daniel to simply take care of Sarah like she was helpless or incapable. Thomas had asked Daniel to make sure Sarah remained the strong and independent woman she truly was, the woman Thomas had fallen in love with precisely because she was not weak or dependent. Daniel explained that when Thomas died and the cabin burned, he had faced a difficult choice. The easy path would have been to take Sarah into his own home, provide for all her needs, make all her decisions, and essentially turn her into someone who depended on him for everything. That was what society expected, what the townspeople suggested, what appeared to be the proper and charitable thing to do. But Daniel believed that path would have destroyed something essential in Sarah, would have turned her into someone she was not meant to be. So he made a harder choice. He chose to let Sarah find her own strength, to discover her own capabilities, to prove to herself that she could survive the worst that life threw at her. He admitted that watching her struggle had been incredibly difficult for him. There had been many moments when he almost abandoned his plan and stepped in to help. He had brought supplies with him on several occasions, prepared to end Sarah's suffering by providing what she needed. But each time he saw her still fighting, still building, still refusing to give up despite hunger and pain and exhaustion. He held back because he knew she was proving something important not just to him, but to herself. Daniel told Sarah that she had accomplished something extraordinary during these terrible weeks. She had survived circumstances that would have broken most people. She had built shelter from ruined materials. She had continued forward when every rational reason said she should quit. Women throughout the territory were talking about the widow McKenna who would not be defeated, who rebuilt with her own hands, who chose dignity over dependence, even when dependence would have been easier and more comfortable. Daniel said that Thomas would have been incredibly proud of what Sarah had achieved. Then Daniel said something that surprised Sarah even more than anything else he had revealed. He admitted that watching her had changed him too. Seeing her courage had shown him his own cowardice. He realized that he had spent his entire life watching from the sidelines, observing rather than participating, letting fear of failure keep him isolated and alone. Sarah's example had taught him that real strength meant taking action despite fear, meant building even with broken materials, meant trying even when success seemed impossible. Her struggle had been a mirror that showed Daniel his own need to stop watching and start living. Sarah lay in the dirt listening to these words, her mind struggling to process what Daniel was saying. Everything she had thought about his behavior, all her assumptions about his cruelty and his judgment, suddenly appeared in a completely different light. Daniel had not been torturing her or taking pleasure in her pain. He had been giving her the space to discover her own strength, even though watching her suffer had been painful for him too. Sarah did not know whether to feel grateful for this revelation or angry that Daniel had chosen such a hard path for both of them. Her emotions were too complicated and conflicted for simple categorization. But one thing became clear to her as she lay there looking up at Daniel's face, really looking at him for the first time since Thomas died. Daniel had seen her at her absolute worst, at her weakest and most desperate, and he had not turned away. He had believed in her strength even when she doubted it herself. That belief, expressed through his strange and difficult choice to watch rather than rescue, had ultimately helped her survive. After this conversation, the relationship between Sarah and Daniel changed completely. Daniel walked forward and helped Sarah to her feet, checking that she had no serious injuries from her fall. He brought her to his horse and gave her food from his saddlebag, simple bread and dried meat that Sarah ate slowly because her stomach had shrunk from weeks of near starvation. Daniel told her that he had an offer to make, a proposal that he had been thinking about for several weeks but had waited to present until he was certain Sarah had proven her own strength. His offer was this. Sarah's land had good water access from a creek that ran along the property line between her land and Daniel's ranch. If Sarah was willing, they could form a business partnership, running cattle across both properties and splitting the work and profits equally. This would give Sarah a reliable income while allowing her to remain on her own land and maintain her independence. It was not charity and not a rescue. It was a genuine business proposition between equals. Daniel explained that he would provide the initial cattle and equipment because he had resources Sarah currently lacked. But Sarah would repay this investment through her share of the work and eventually through a small percentage of her profits until the debt was cleared. After that, they would be true equal partners with neither owing the other anything except the respect and cooperation that any business partnership required. Daniel made clear that this arrangement would not change Sarah's ownership of her land or her autonomy in making decisions about her own life. She would not be his employee or his dependent. She would be his partner in a business arrangement that benefited both of them. Sarah listened to this proposal carefully, understanding that accepting it represented a crucial choice about what kind of future she wanted to build. If she accepted, she would be admitting that she could not survive entirely alone, that she needed help even though she had proven she could endure incredible hardship. But she would also be securing a practical path forward, a way to actually thrive rather than just barely survive. Sarah told Daniel that she needed time to think about his offer. She also told him that if she decided to accept the partnership, she had one important condition. She insisted that before they began working together, she must first finish building her shelter completely on her own. This was crucial to Sarah in ways she could not fully explain even to herself. The shelter had become more than just a physical structure. It represented her journey from devastation to survival, from helpless widow to capable woman. She needed to complete what she had started before moving forward into a new phase of her life. She needed to prove to herself that she could finish what she began, that her survival was not ultimately dependent on Daniel's assistance, but was something she had earned through her own efforts and determination. Daniel agreed to Sarah's condition without hesitation. He understood that this was about more than practical construction. It was about Sarah claiming her own story, about finishing a journey she had started in grief and desperation. Daniel promised that he would not help with the shelter's completion, but he would share knowledge and techniques that might make Sarah's work easier and more effective. He taught her how to mix mud and grass together to seal gaps between boards, a technique he had learned from Native Americans. He explained better ways to set posts and join boards so structures remained stable during storms. He showed her how to use stones and clay to build a proper chimney for indoor fires. With this knowledge and with her own hard-won experience, Sarah spent the next 3 weeks completing her shelter. She worked from sunrise to sunset every day, driven by a powerful need to finish what she had started. The structure grew from a tiny lean-to into a small but functional cabin with proper walls, a door that could close and latch, a window covered with oiled paper, and a chimney that drew smoke upward instead of filling the interior. The completed shelter was nothing like the comfortable cabin she and Thomas had built together. It was smaller, rougher, built from inferior materials by less skilled hands. But it was sound and weatherproof, and entirely her own creation. Every board had been placed by her hands. Every nail had been hammered by her will. The shelter stood as physical proof that Sarah McKenna could survive anything, could build from nothing, could transform broken pieces into something whole and functional. The day Sarah hammered the final nail, the day she stepped back and looked at her completed work, tears ran down her face. But these were not tears of grief or pain. They were tears of pride and accomplishment, tears that washed away some of the sorrow she had carried since Thomas died. Sarah accepted Daniel's partnership offer the day after completing her shelter. They began working together to build a small cattle operation across their combined lands. The work was incredibly hard, harder than anything Sarah had experienced even during her weeks of desperate shelter building. Ranching required knowledge and skills that Sarah did not possess, and had to learn through trial and error and Daniel's patient teaching. She learned to recognize signs of cattle disease, to predict weather patterns by observing clouds and wind, to manage grazing rotations that kept the land healthy and productive. She learned to rope and brand cattle, to ride for hours across rough terrain checking fence lines and water sources, to make quick decisions in emergencies when animals were in danger. Her body, already strengthened by weeks of construction work, grew even stronger from the constant physical labor. Her hands, permanently scarred by splinters and calluses, learned to handle ropes and tools with increasing skill and confidence. Daniel proved to be a good partner in the business sense. He was fair in dividing work and profits. He respected Sarah's opinions even when they disagreed about the best approach to a problem. He never treated her as less capable or less intelligent simply because she was a woman or because she was still learning ranching skills he had known for years. Their working relationship was professional and respectful, built on mutual benefit rather than charity or obligation. But more than the practical success of their partnership, working alongside Daniel helped Sarah in ways she had not anticipated. The grief over Thomas's death, which had been overwhelming and paralyzing in the early weeks after his death, gradually transformed into something Sarah could carry without being crushed by it. She learned to remember Thomas and the good years they had shared without being destroyed by the loss. She discovered that moving forward and building a new life did not mean betraying Thomas's memory. It meant honoring everything he had believed about her strength and capabilities. The partnership between Sarah and Daniel proved successful beyond either of their initial expectations. Their combined lands and resources created efficiencies that benefited both of them. Within a year, they had built a modest herd and turned a small profit. Sarah used her share of that profit to expand her shelter into a proper two-room cabin with real glass windows and a wooden floor. She bought a milk cow, laying hens for eggs, and a good saddle horse so she no longer had to walk everywhere or borrow Daniel's horses. She acquired furniture piece by piece, building some items herself with skills learned during her shelter construction, and trading for others with eggs and butter from her growing homestead. Her land began to look lived in and purposeful again, transformed from a disaster site into a working ranch. The physical improvements to her property reflected the internal changes happening within Sarah herself. The desperate, starving widow who had hammered broken boards together, while silently watched, had evolved into a capable rancher and businesswoman who commanded respect from her neighbors and partners. Daniel changed during this period too. The partnership with Sarah brought him out of the isolated existence he had lived for so many years. He began attending social gatherings in town again. He helped neighbors with their projects and accepted help in return, something he had rarely done before. He even began courting a woman named Margaret who had recently moved to the territory, and everyone noticed that Daniel seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by whatever internal weights he had carried for so long. The townspeople who had once gossiped about Daniel's strange treatment of Sarah now spoke admiringly of the successful partnership between Thomas's widow and his brother. Some said Daniel had been wise to test Sarah's strength before offering help. Others said Sarah had proven that women could succeed in business if given fair opportunity. The truth, as Sarah and Daniel both knew, was more complex than these simple narratives. They had both been changed by their strange and difficult journey together, both tested and transformed in ways that went beyond simple success or failure. Success brought its own complications. Other ranchers in the territory, men who had paid little attention to Sarah when she was struggling alone, now took notice of her productive land and growing herd. Several made offers to buy her property at prices far below its actual value, assuming a woman would not understand business well enough to recognize she was being cheated. A few tried more aggressive tactics, warning Sarah that a woman rancher invited trouble from outlaws and rustlers, suggesting she should sell to a man who could properly protect the land. One particularly unpleasant neighbor began deliberately driving his cattle across Sarah's property, damaging her fences and grazing his animals on her grass without permission. When Sarah confronted him about this behavior, he laughed and said she should get her man to handle business matters if she could not manage them herself. These challenges tested Sarah in different ways than her early struggles had. Building a shelter from broken boards had required physical endurance and determination. Defending her business success required strategic thinking, careful documentation, and willingness to stand firm against intimidation. Sarah met these new challenges with the same stubborn strength she had shown in her darkest days. When ranchers made unfair offers for her land, Sarah countered with detailed calculations showing her property's true value based on water access, grazing capacity, and market prices for comparable parcels. When they tried to intimidate her with warnings about dangers facing woman ranchers, she calmly pointed out that she had survived losing her husband, her home, and nearly starving to death, so their empty threats did not frighten someone who had already faced real catastrophe. When her neighbor continued trespassing with his cattle, Sarah documented every incident carefully with dates and damage estimates, then filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office that resulted in her neighbor being fined and ordered to repair her fences at his own expense. Daniel supported Sarah completely during these conflicts, making it clear to everyone that she was a full partner with equal authority, and that any agreements made without her involvement would not be honored. His backing carried weight in the community and helped establish Sarah's credibility as a serious businesswoman rather than just a widow playing at ranching. 5 years after Thomas's death, Sarah sat on the porch of her now comfortable cabin and reflected on how far she had traveled from that desperate woman hammering broken boards together. Her ranch was genuinely prosperous now. She employed 2 ranch hands during busy seasons and had become known throughout the territory as a skilled and knowledgeable rancher. She served on the board of the local Ranchers Association, one of only 2 women in the entire territory to hold such a position. Young women from neighboring ranches sometimes came to ask her advice about business matters, or to learn ranching skills from someone who understood the particular challenges women faced in this male-dominated world. Sarah welcomed these visitors and shared what she had learned, always emphasizing that every person had to find their own path forward, and that her story was just one example among many possible ways to survive and thrive. Daniel married Margaret and started a family, becoming a father to 2 daughters who he raised with constant reminders that they could be as strong and capable as their Aunt Sarah, as everyone now called her. Daniel told his daughters stories about the woman who rebuilt from ashes, who built shelter from broken boards, who refused to be defeated by circumstances that would have crushed someone with less determination. He wanted his daughters to understand that strength came in many forms, and that courage meant continuing forward despite fear and doubt. Sarah remained unmarried, despite occasional expressions of interest from various men in the territory. She explained to those close to her that she had loved Thomas deeply and still carried that love, but her decision not to remarry was not about remaining faithful to a ghost. It was about preserving the hard-won independence and autonomy she had fought so desperately to achieve. She had learned to be complete in herself, to find satisfaction in her work and her friendships and her own company, and the idea of surrendering any part of that independence to a new husband held no appeal. Sarah never tore down the small shelter she had built with broken boards, even after constructing her larger and more comfortable cabin. She kept that original structure standing on her property as a reminder of where she had been and what she had survived. Sometimes on difficult days, Sarah would sit inside that small rough shelter and run her hands over the blackened boards, remembering the woman she had been when she hammered them into place with bleeding hands and an empty stomach and absolute determination not to break. The shelter became something of a landmark in the region. People would point it out to newcomers and tell various versions of Sarah McKenna's story, some accurate and some embellished, but all containing the same core truth. A woman had lost everything and refused to be destroyed. A woman had built from nothing and created something lasting. The shelter stood as proof that survival was possible, that strength could be found even in the darkest moments, that broken materials could still build something whole if you refused to stop trying. Visitors to Sarah's ranch often asked to see the famous shelter, and Sarah would show them inside, explaining how she had built it piece by piece with salvaged materials and minimal skills. She emphasized to these visitors that her success had not come from being special or exceptional. It had come from simply refusing to give up, from hammering one more nail even when her hands bled, from taking one more step even when exhaustion made her dizzy, from trying one more day even when hope seemed impossible. She wanted people to understand that they did not need perfect circumstances or ideal materials to begin building better lives. They could start with whatever broken pieces they had available, whatever limited resources they could gather, whatever small amount of strength they could summon on their worst days. The crucial thing was to start, to take that first action despite fear and doubt, to keep building even when progress seemed impossibly slow. Sarah McKenna lived into her early 60s, a respectable age for frontier life, where so many died young from accidents or disease or simply the accumulated toll of hard living. Her later years brought a measure of peace that would have seemed impossible during those desperate weeks after Thomas's death. She took on a younger female partner named Rachel, whose husband had abandoned her with 3 small children, teaching Rachel the ranching skills and business knowledge she had learned over decades. This partnership echoed Sarah's own relationship with Daniel, though under different circumstances, and Sarah found deep satisfaction in helping another woman discover her own strength and capabilities. When Sarah died in her sleep in 1898, her funeral drew people from across the territory. The newspaper obituaries recounted her remarkable journey from widowed disaster to successful independence. But perhaps more significant than these public remembrances were the private ways Sarah's influence continued spreading outward through time. Rachel continued running the ranch using Sarah's methods and eventually passed that knowledge to her daughters. Daniel's daughters grew into strong, independent women who credited their Aunt Sarah's example with showing them alternatives to traditional limited roles. Women who had written to Sarah over the years seeking advice carried her lessons into their own struggles and shared them with their own communities. The shelter itself stood for nearly 30 more years after Sarah's death, gradually weathering but still recognizable. When it finally collapsed during a severe storm in 1927, local historians salvaged some of the boards and preserved them in the regional museum, where they can still be seen today by anyone who wants to touch a piece of history. And imagine the desperate determination it took to hammer those broken boards together under the merciless sun, while being watched by a silent figure testing whether she would break or endure. Sarah McKenna's story reaches across the years and touches something universal about human experience that transcends her specific time and place. Her journey from that terrible moment when she stood among ashes with nothing left to the eventual success and influence she achieved asks questions that every generation must answer for itself. What do we do when everything is taken from us? How do we find strength to continue when continuation seems impossible? How do we maintain dignity when circumstances try to strip it away? Sarah's answer to these questions was not complicated or sophisticated. She simply refused to accept that her circumstances defined her destiny. She took the broken pieces available to her and built something whole, one nail at a time, one board at a time, one day at a time. She proved that survival and eventual thriving were possible not because she was special or exceptionally gifted, but because she would not stop trying, would not surrender to despair, would not let loss define her future. The relationship between Sarah and Daniel adds another layer of meaning to her story, raising difficult questions about how we help those we care about, and when allowing struggle becomes its own form of support. Daniel's choice to watch rather than immediately rescue Sarah seemed cruel from one perspective, but ultimately gave her something more valuable than an easier path. It gave her the opportunity to discover her own strength, to build genuine confidence through real accomplishment, to prove to herself that she was capable of surviving anything. This does not mean that everyone who struggles should be left to suffer without support. Every situation is different and requires its own careful consideration. But Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is belief in their strength, even when that belief requires us to witness their struggle without interfering. Most powerfully, Sarah McKenna's story reminds us that strength emerges from unexpected sources and takes forms we might not recognize at first glance. The image of a widow building a shelter with broken boards while being watched by her dead husband's silent brother could easily become a story about victimhood and cruelty. But Sarah transformed her situation through the only power truly available to her, the power of her own will and her own bleeding hands. She turned broken materials into shelter, grief into determination, observation into opportunity, disaster into triumph. She built not just a physical structure but an entire life from fragments that others might have dismissed as unusable. That transformation, that absolute refusal to accept limitations imposed by circumstances or society, remains her most powerful legacy. The boards she hammered together that hot afternoon under Daniel's watchful gaze held more than just a roof and walls. They held proof that human beings possess extraordinary resilience when we refuse to surrender, that broken pieces can still build something beautiful and lasting, that we are defined not by what happens to us, but by how we respond to what happens. Sarah McKenna took the worst moments of her life and used them as foundation stones for everything that followed, and her story still whispers through the wind today, reminding anyone who listens that we are all capable of building shelter from broken boards if only we refuse to stop hammering.